As with white-collar crimes, there are a number of green-collar crimes, and we're only going to touch on the most common ones. But I want to start with some cases. Whaling is a violation of environmental laws, actually international laws. They call them international conventions, but killing whales. And it constitutes a form of environmental crime. Intentional pollution, causing pollution, state level, federal level. Sometimes, though, even negligence contributes to environmental criminality. And some examples of that would be the supertanker owned by Exxon, which ran into the coast of Alaska, 1989, spilling 11 million gallons of crude oil over 1,700 miles of coastline. In September 1994, an Alaskan jury ordered Exxon to pay $5 billion in punitive damages to 14,000 people that were affected by the spill, and another $287 million in actual damages to commercial fishermen in that region. Exxon also agreed to pay $100 million in criminal fines. Also, in 2014, Noble Drilling pled guilty to 8 federal criminal charges and agreed to pay $12.2 million in fines and violations of the Federal Act to prevent pollution from ships. The violations occurred when Noble had problems managing the rubbish and wastewater that was accumulating in the engine room space of the Noble Discoverer. Company personnel then devised a makeshift pump system to discharge water that had entered the vessel's engine room, the machinery spaces, directly overboard they were dumping it overboard without processing it through the pollution prevention equipment, which is required by law. They also failed to notify the Coast Guard about this system and took steps to actively hide the fact that it was being used. The company was also placed on a term of probation for 4 years. These are the companies. These aren't the people. The people are doing the acts, but these are the corporations themselves. Another example, BP, who agreed to pay billions in compensation stemming from the Gulf oil spill from April of 2010. The disaster occurred when the company's deep water drilling platform, Deepwater Horizon, suffered an explosion and fire, and it sank, releasing 206 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. So it came from a wellhead from 5,000 feet below the surface. So the company has agreed to pay out $37 billion in oil spill expenses. And these are just some of the devastating examples that companies and businesses engage in relative to the environment, to destroying the environment or causing damage to the environment. So we're going to look at green-collar crime. What is it? Generally, it's a crime committed against the environment. That's the general definition, but there really is no single definition. However, there are separate views that exist, and they kind of go from the tightest definition down to a more expansive definition. The legalist: environmental crimes are violations of existing criminal laws designed to protect people, environment, or both. And that's a pretty restrictive measurement because there could be some acts that aren't necessarily defined in a criminal law. Hence, they wouldn't then be criminal. Then there's the environmental justice view. Green crime should encompass all acts that have identifiable environmental damage outcomes and originated in human action. And these actions may or may not violate existing laws. So this is slightly broader. A lot of acts occur outside of the bounds of the laws, and some countries don't even have environmental laws. Another view is the biocentric, which is even broader. Environmental harm is viewed as any human activity that disrupts a biosystem, destroying plant and animal life, criminalizes intentional and negligent human acts. So not just something that you're actually going out to do intentionally to hurt the environment, but it just might be your carelessness as well. Under this view, it's humans that cause environmental harm, and as such, they need to be controlled. Humans need to be controlled. And then the even more expansive view, the harms perspective, all activities that cause physical, economic, emotional, or psychological and cultural harm to individuals and or the environment should be criminalized. This focuses on things like secondary effects, dumping toxic waste into a river that flows into the town's water source. People drink the water, and now they're in that town. There's an uptick of cancer-related deaths, right? There was a book about that called The Civil Action, where that actually happened. That happens all the time. It isn't just a one-shot thing. The Aaron Brockovich story that was very famous for that, the scenario. There's actions by a corporation plant. Unfortunately, they weren't criminal because it wasn't a criminal lawsuit. So these things become civil lawsuits, and then they have to pay damages if there is a connection. They have to show a connection or a cause. But the Aaron Brockovich, California town where the residents were getting sick, was traced back to a corporation that was dumping toxin into the drinking water. So let's talk about some examples of green-collar crime. Some examples of green-collar crime are apparent to all of us and are in the news more often than others. Take, for instance, deforestation and illegal logging, both of which harm trees and the surrounding environment, including the wildlife. For example, the illegal logging in Central Africa, threatening the survival of gorillas. These acts also threaten entire ecosystems and the people that depend on these ecosystems for their survival. Another example of green-collar crime is the illegal exportation of or illegal exporting of wildlife. And you will be shocked at how this happens. People sometimes put birds, snakes, and other animals up and down their bodies. They carry them on under their clothing while trying to sneak these animals into the country, get across customs. Not only does the illegal exportation of wildlife hurt local wildlife populations from where they are hunted, but it also poses a danger to the new ecosystem into which they're brought. If the animals are released, they may threaten the survival of local native species. And this happens down prominently in the Florida Everglades. They're full of reptiles that are brought here from South America illegally as pets. But then they outgrow the people, big pythons, and then they release them into the wild. But illegal export of wildlife is more than just exporting live animals. It's also parts of animals, like shark fins, obtained as a result of illegal fishing. Also rhinoceros horns and elephant tusks. The list goes on and on. The poaching of animals has led to the extinction of some animals and near extinction of others, such as some types of rhinoceroses. So that's one other I think I covered two forms of fishing in the wildlife. Green-collar crime also includes pollution. Industries dump toxic industrial waste into local river systems, killing off fish and other animals, as well as polluting our drinking water. Oil pipelines burst and leak, spewing toxic oil into rivers, lakes, seas, and lands that tarnish and destroy our nature and even our livelihoods. A current problem that is still growing is the disposal of obsolete electronics, TVs, laptops, computers, VCRs. The toxic materials contained in these electronics, i.e. lead, are being dumped illegally, and in some instances shipped to developed nations illegally to be dumped in and near local villages, which serves as a threat to their human health and environment. Lastly, green-collar crimes cover worker safety. It's not just the environment and lands, human beings too. Worker safety. Corporations don't really like to be regulated, especially in the area of environment protections and worker safety. For some reason, they don't think it's important, and it affects the bottom line. Having parameters in place for these costs them money. Many have unsafe work conditions, especially in plants and mines. Many people who work in these industries haven't been exposed to hazardous materials that have long-term effects. Asbestos. One of those comes to top of my head. So the U.S. government has the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, that sets the standard for proper use of various chemicals within these plants and mines and other businesses, corporations that use such hazardous material. Sadly, many of the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency standards, and we'll talk about the EPA, have been repealed or rolled back by the current administration to encourage energy production in oil, gas, and coal industries. Unfortunately, this could lead to devastating effects on the environment, but only time will tell. So these forms we just covered are the obvious examples of green-collar crime, but you must understand that there are less obvious ones and ones that are nuances. For instance, you wouldn't think of farming as a green-collar crime, but the runoff of pesticides, bacteria, and substances found in animals' manure can actually harm the environment. You may not think of chicken farming as green-collar crime, pumping chickens full of additives to make them grow painfully large, crowding them in cages where they can't move and live a normal life, and then they're transporting them to long distances without being fed or watered before stunning them with electrified water prior to slitting their throats. That is a green-collar crime for us to eat, by the way. That's a green-collar crime. That may not be, if we're working under the legalist theory, may not actually be a criminal law. But these things are out there, and should they be criminalized? Why do people commit these types of crimes? Why would they risk their positions, their freedom? Can the same factors that predict other types of criminal offenses apply to these situations? These are crime, we're talking about the street collar crimes that we were talking about, or talking about the various theories earlier in the semester. Crimes usually committed, by teens. Some of the theories, crimes committed by teens or people in poor communities or in urban cities, all of these ideas. But we're talking about, for the most part, we're talking about environmental crimes, white collar crimes, and green collar crimes being committed for the most part by respectable, educated people who are financially well off. So can there be theories that predict and explain these kind of crimes? Can the ones that explain common law crime work here? Well, there's some that have been put forth. Greed as a motivating factor, which leads one to make a rational choice to commit such a crime. People who take shortcuts to obtain more wealth or status. They weigh the benefits, i.e. the profit, over the risk, i.e. getting caught. Even those that get caught and serve their time retain a good portion of the money they earn. They serve some time, they get out, and they have money. For example, from the book The CEO Enron, or the Wall Street trader who bet on corporate takeovers and made $200 billion. Or $1 million, or the billionaire junk bond trader. Explained in the book, Michael Minlin. And despite only spending 22 months in prison and paying a $200 million fine and another $400 to $800 million to settle lawsuits, he's still worth $3.5 billion. Not too shabby, right? For that kind of conduct. Lore is the concept described by criminologists to explain why some people succumb to the illegal yet alluring benefit of crime. It is something that's attractive, that it can turn the heads of those who are tempted. The folks that are tempted they usually possess qualities or experiences that make them more likely to weigh illicit exploitation of the lure. For one example, finding loopholes in the law. There's loopholes in the law. They're easy to manipulate, right? Using an unused parcel of land. No, nobody lives here. Nobody's using this. Let me just dump the trash here. Without having some controls on such behavior, you have instances like the market crash in 2008. Was that driven by greed? Need? Cost taxpayers a lot of money, white collar crime. Nobody, by the way, for the 2008 market crash, nobody was charged. Nobody faced criminal charges. Nobody was punished in any way for what happened, but the taxpayers bailed out all of those major financial institutions. What was that driven by? Could we say greed? Could we say need? I would say greed. So need. Let's talk about need. Rational choice. Another motivating factor. Some commit these types of crimes to fulfill a financial or sometimes a psychological need. They do these things to keep their job. Maybe they have pressure to keep their job, especially when demands for certain goals are being made, but they're not unattainable because of existing laws or how the business framework is. Or maybe they do it to support their families, or there's just some inner need. I need more. They reach here. Let's see how far I can go. I need more. In a number of instances, turning to white-collar crime is convenient for solving an immediate financial problem versus some other legal avenue that might take a long time, hoops to get through, or may just even be a block. Rationalization, neutralization. What they can do is they rationalize it by saying, so what? I just bent the rules. It's not a big deal. It's just a technicality. Everybody does it. They don't view the act as being a crime. It's not a big deal if we take a little money out of this cash to cover this account to cover this over here, and we'll just replace it a little later. Who's going to know? Maybe it doesn't get replaced because there's no money that ever comes in. But they don't look at it as crime. Just a technicality. Everybody's doing it. There's a cultural view. Committing these types of crimes is part of the norm. That's what we do in this business setting. It's another view on the way people commit such crimes. This is the normal practice. Maybe in the industry itself, or maybe just in that one particular business. We all are kind of taking shortcuts. The self-control view, another view, is that the motives producing these crimes are the same as those that produce other criminal acts. Quick benefits, minimal efforts. They do it because they have no self-control, or low self-control. They may have no or low self-control, or they're led by some impulse, monetary impulse, without considering the long-term effects or costs caused by the acts. The self-control theory. Just some views on why these crimes get committed. How do we control white-collar and green-collar crimes? They're controlled at all levels of government who have some laws in place to deter these types of crimes. At the federal level, action is generally taken upon receiving an agency receiving complaints of such conduct going on versus it being some law enforcement agent conducting some investigation. So it's more of a reactive than a proactive way of controlling this type of crime. It's federal agencies that are tasked with investigating complaints if there is some justification to the claim to pursue the matter as a criminal matter. Then the agency will refer the matter to the U.S. Department of Justice or the FBI for full-out prosecution. However, the agency may decide that the violations are not or should not be subjected to criminal charges and may just hand it off or deal with it as a civil case, i.e. they just impose some fines. Agencies that work this way, the Food and Drug Administration, they may take complaints regarding food quality that's being produced, such as that chicken example I gave you. The Federal Trade Commission, they're tasked with handling consumer complaints, whether that be defective products, false advertising, a whole number of other consumer-type complaints against companies. At the state level, the Attorney General is tasked with protecting consumers and the environment within the bounds of the state. Many have specific departments designed to a particular area of activity. Under New York's Attorney General, there's an environmental division, a consumer protection division, a healthcare Medicaid fraud division, antitrust division, and internet crime, and among others, they have internet crimes. But number of other individualized areas of law that protect that are investigating or prosecuting white-collar and green-collar crimes. At the local levels, it depends on each municipality. Some may have a task force specific to an area involving white-collar crime. Others leave it up to the state to prosecute the serious of these types of crimes. So let's talk about specific environmental laws. We are only going to touch on the federal environmental statutes, by the way, because each state has their own body of law that protects the environment within its bounds. New York has the Adirondack Park. It is overseen by the Adirondack Park Agency, which governs the use of the lands, public and private. But there's also a full body of law with specially trained law enforcement agencies, the Department of Environmental Conservation, that prosecute and hand out criminal sanctions with regards to environmental crimes. But we are going to touch on the federal laws. These laws focus on protecting the land, the air, the water, the wildlife. There are a number of others, but these are the key acts, and they're outlined in the book. The Clean Water Act from 1972, it's aimed at protecting the quality and purity of U.S. water. By doing so, it sets and maintains goals and standards. It effectively is controlling the pollution of the water, and they also address oil spills in the water, and that's generally what it does. Believe me, it's a very huge act, and it's been amended several times, and there's been some rollbacks, as I said, relative to that. The Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act from 1986 requires companies to disclose information about toxic chemicals they release into the air and water and dispose of on land. The Endangered Species Act, 1973, protects wildlife, plants, and fish, but not only protect them from extinction, but also recover endangered and threatened species and help them to once again thrive. Oil Pollution Act, 1990, enacted after the major oil spill in Alaska that I told you about, which streamlined and strengthened the Environmental Protection Agency, their ability to prevent and respond to catastrophic oil spills. A trust fund financed by a tax on oil is available to clean up spills when the responsibility party is incapable or unwilling to do so. So the OPA requires oil storage facilities and vessels to submit to the federal government plans detailing how they will respond to large discharges. The OPA also requires the development of area contingency plans to prepare and plan for oil spill response on a regional scale. And the law, lastly, also increased liability for those who cause the spill. So how are these laws enforced? Well, when an environmental or green-collar crime has been committed, at the federal level, federal authorities will be responsible for enforcing and investigating and prosecuting. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife is one such agency, but they are restricted in their jurisdiction. So their job is to protect and conserve wildlife and enforce the laws of the Endangered Species Act. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement investigates crimes that include international and domestic smuggling rings that target endangered animals, unlawful commercial exploitation of protected species, violations of migratory game bird hunting laws, and other illegal takings, such as killing a bald eagle. Another is our Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and they have the authority to investigate all environmental crimes under all of the statutes just discussed, and then some others. Enforcing environmental laws is the central part of their plan to protect human health and the environment. EPA works to ensure compliance with environmental requirements. When warranted, they will take civil or criminal enforcement action against violators of these environmental laws. And they have two divisions, the civil, the criminal. We're going to discuss criminal. That's what we're focusing on, criminal cases. So most environmental crimes involve intentional violations of the law, which are classified as felonies under the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. If there are no intentional conduct, then it may be a civil action, like an accidental spill of a toxic substance into the water. But an example of criminal action, for example, an intentional decision to discharge pollutants into a river without a permit or to bypass a required pollution control device is a criminal act, and it carries penalties such as the possibility of incarceration of those involved and monetary fines for those involved and for the corporation, if it's a business that we're talking about doing this sort of conduct. Examples of environmental crimes investigated by the EPA include air emissions of toxic pollutants resulting from inadequate or non-existent pollution control, illegal asbestos removals that expose and create health risks for workers and the public, illegal discharges into waters and sewer systems that threaten public safety and cause damage to our water infrastructure, illegal handling, transporting, and disposal of hazardous waste and pesticides, oil spills, and false statements made to the EPA that threaten the integrity of the environmental protection programs is also a crime. So an EPA prosecutor gets involved early in the investigation. That's usually early in the investigation means when they have prepared an affidavit, provided it to the court for the issuance of a warrant, search warrant, usually to obtain evidence or to enter a premises, or when a grand jury's investigation power is needed. So, same process as we discussed a couple weeks ago in the book regarding the criminal process, how the grand jury gets involved and hands down indictment. Once the necessary evidence is collected, prosecutor presents the case for grand jury, and the idea is to get an indictment. So after there's an indictment, the prosecutor guides the case through the pre-trial stages and begins preparing for trial. Although, as we know from our discussions about courts, most cases settle through plea agreements, but some do not. And those that go to trial, the EPA has an excellent record, as it notes in the book, and it's also available information from the EPA on their website. From October 1998 through September 2014, they concluded criminal cases against more than over 1,000 individuals and over 400 corporate defendants, leading to 774 years of incarceration and $825 million in fines and restitution. Restitution is paying back those that have been damaged. As stated before, state and local governments also address environmental crimes, often in the context of state regulations that are linked to parallel federal statutes. They kind of follow each other's guidelines, but the states are within their own bounds and local governments are within their bounds. In many instances, the same actions may be violations, though, of federal, state, and local laws. So what they do is, to preserve resources, the federal prosecutor may have a task force that includes all of these members, federal, state, and local, to handle the environmental crimes jointly. So that's generally how we enforce these environment or green collar and white collar crimes. Let's talk about deterrence. If the prevailing wisdom is that those who commit white collar and green collar crime are rarely prosecuted, and when convicted get a light punishment, then what efforts have been made to bring violators of the public trust to justice? And there are two strategies. We've talked about deterrence, and the other one is compliance. So, compliance, the threat of economic sanctions or civil penalties, control violators. So the greater the violation, the greater the penalty. This takes the focus off of the person and focuses on the criminal act. Who controls this? Government agencies, the EPA for green collar crimes, or the specific agency that governs or regulates the industry the business is in. For example, the Security Exchange Commission governs stocks, bonds, securities, and those that work in that particular industry. Mentioned earlier, the Food and Drug Administration and the Federal Trade Commission, they handle, violations relative to, food complaints and such, and the Federal Trade Commission, consumer complaints. The second strategy is deterrence, which is just like it sounds, and used just like in any other crime. The punishment of individual offenders deter other would-be violators. So despite the reluctance to put corporate types in jail, prosecutors will seek, and courts will do so as to send a message in hopes of preventing others from engaging in the same conduct, especially if a case where people are swindled out of billions of dollars, causing them to lose their life savings in most cases. Because of the number of high-profile cases, like Bernie Madoff, hefty fines, long jail sentences are starting to become more frequent. So I want to close this discussion with a case. It's actually a case in both white-collar crime and green-collar crime. You may be familiar with it. I'm going to summarize it because it's very long and detailed. The Volkswagen emissions scandal, which is also referred to as Dieselgate or Emissionsgate, began in September 2015 when the EPA issued a notice of violations against the Clean Air Act to Volkswagen Group. The agency had found Volkswagen had intentionally programmed turbocharged direct injection diesel engines to activate their emission controls only during laboratory emissions testing, which caused the vehicle's nitrous oxide output to meet U.S. standards during regulating testing. But in reality, it emitted up to 40 times more in the real world driving. Volkswagen deployed the software in about 11 million cars worldwide, including 500,000 in the U.S. in their model cars between 2009 and 2015. 2014, California Air Resources Board had commissioned a study on emissions discrepancies between Europe and U.S. models of vehicles from the International Council on Clean Transportation. Summing up the data, from 3 different sources on 15 vehicles. Among them was a group of 5 scientists, including students from West Virginia University, who detected additional emissions during live road tests on 2 out of 3 diesel cars. The council also purchased data from 2 other sources. The new road testing data and the purchase data were generated using portable emissions measurement systems developed by multiple individuals in the mid-late 1990s. And was published in May 2014. Regulators in multiple countries began to investigate Volkswagen, and its stock price fell in value by a third in the days immediately after the news. Volkswagen Group CEO resigned, and the head of brand development as well. Audi research and development head and Porsche research development head were suspended. Volkswagen announced plans in April 2016 to spend over $18 billion on rectifying the emissions issue and plan to refit the affected vehicles as part of a recall campaign. In January 2017, Volkswagen, the corporation, pleaded guilty to criminal charges and signed an agreement which drew on the results of the investigation. Volkswagen had itself commissioned from its lawyers. The statement set out how engineers had developed the defective devices because diesel models could not pass U.S. emissions tests without them and deliberately sought to conceal their use. So it was a crime. In April 2017, the U.S. federal judge ordered Volkswagen to pay $2.8 billion in criminal fines for rigging diesel-powered vehicles to cheat on government emissions tests. As of June 1st, 2020, the scandal had cost Volkswagen $33.3 billion in fines, penalties, financial setbacks and buyouts, financial settlements, and buyback costs. Various government and civil actions are currently undergoing in the U.S. as well as in the European Union, where most of the affected vehicles are located. While they remain legal to drive, consumer groups and governments seek to make sure Volkswagen has compensated these owners appropriately, as they had to do in the United States. Now, I did tell you that this was a white-collar crime and a green-collar crime. Right now I gave you the backstory about the EPA investigation and the green-collar component. But at the same time, Federal Trade Commission stepped in, because what happened when they were trying to sell these vehicles? They were engaging in deceptive trade practices, false advertising about how these were energy efficient cars. So they were duping consumers into buying these so-called energy efficient cars. So the Federal Trade Commission got in, white collar crime, and also several states' attorneys got in as well. And as of this recording, in mid-2020, the three CEOs, actually September 2020, the three CEOs that I mentioned for Volkswagen, Audi, and Porsche are now on criminal trial individually for their intentional conduct. So this is a big case. Anyway, that covers our economic crimes. And this week's assignment will focus on the Deepwater Horizon event, as well as about Bernie Madoff.